There are places on this earth that have never fully surrendered their secrets. Deep places, old places, places where the stone has been sitting in the same arrangement, in the same darkness, for so many millions of years that it has had time to forget what the surface looks like, to forget that sunlight is a thing that happens, to settle into a permanent mineral dark that is not absence but presence, a different kind of presence, the presence of time itself, compacted into limestone and calcite, and the slow crystalline growth of things that have no reason to hurry because they are not going anywhere, and they have nowhere to be, and the world above them has risen and fallen and risen again in the time they have been quietly doing what caves do, which is wait. Australia is full of places like that, more than most people know, more than most maps will ever show, because maps are surfaces. And the most important things about this continent are not on its surface. They are underneath, in the dark, in the stone, in the particular quality of silence that gathers in spaces where no light has reached in longer than any human civilization has existed. And a body was pulled from one of them, a body that nobody, with all the science available to this era, with all the sequencing technology and the dating methods, and the comparative anatomy databases and the genomic reference libraries that collectively represent the accumulated biological knowledge of centuries of systematic inquiry, has been able to identify, not with certainty, not with the confidence that science requires before it is willing to attach a name to a thing and call the question answered, when the body is somewhere comfortable and the mind is beginning to let its grip loosen on everything it has been holding since morning. When the particular quality of attention that a story like this requires is available to you, the kind that slows the breath and softens the body into wherever it is resting, and lets the mind settle, the way sediment settles in still water, into a state where the strange and the slow and the very, very old can reach it. Settle in, let everything else go quiet. There are 15 things you need to know about the body that was pulled from the cave. We're going to take our time with all of them. There is no hurry here. The cave waited a very long time for someone to find this body. We can afford to move slowly. Before we begin, take a moment and comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. We want to know where this story finds you, in what corner of the world, in what hour of the night or the early morning when the quiet has finally settled. And if this is the kind of content that takes you somewhere slower and quieter than where you started, please click like and subscribe. It means more than we can say. It keeps this work alive and allows us to keep making it. Now, we begin. Number 1, the cave itself and everything it was before anyone thought to look inside it. To understand what was found inside the cave, you first have to understand what kind of place the cave was. Not just geologically, although the geology is important, and we will get to it. Not just geographically, although the geography matters, and we will describe it. You have to understand the cave as a presence in the landscape, as something that had been there, doing what it does, in the dark and the quiet, for longer than any human institution on this planet has existed, longer than any written record extends, longer than any city that stands today has been standing, doing it without urgency, doing it without any particular awareness that what it was doing would one day become a question that scientists would argue about in laboratories and institutions, would redact in filing rooms, and people in various corners of the world would stay up past their own bedtimes to read about. South Australia is not the part of the continent that most people picture when they think of Australia. It is not the red centre, the ochre plains that shimmer in the noon heat in a way that makes the horizon look unreliable, the flat-topped mazes and the stunted spinifex and the particular quality of midday light in the interior desert that seems less like illumination and more like pressure, like the sun is pressing down on the surface of the world with the full weight of its indifference. It is not the tropical north with its monsoonal forests and its waterholes and the paperbark trees that line the permanent water, in a way that makes the landscape feel generous and ancient and alive in a very specific sense, alive in the way of things that have found everything they need and are not going anywhere. South Australia is older than either of those pictures, though not in the geological sense, because the whole continent is geologically old in a way that makes the comparison meaningless. It is older in a different sense, quieter. The limestone country of the south sits on a foundation that was laid down when the continent was still part of a supercontinent, still pressed against Antarctica in a geological embrace that lasted for hundreds of millions of years, and left its mark in the chemistry and the architecture of the stone. The rock here was once a seabed. For millions of years, an inland sea covered this landscape, and when the sea retreated, it left behind the accumulated chemistry of its floor, calcium carbonate compressed by time and weight and geological process into the pale, dense limestone that defines this country, a country of hidden water, a country of rivers that disappear into sinkholes and travel for kilometers underground before surfacing again in a different place. A country of chambers and galleries and passages that open one into another in a geography that no map can fully represent because maps require a surface. And the most significant features of this landscape have no surface expression at all. They are below, they are in the dark, they are the part of the country that only certain people and certain things have ever known. The Nullarbor Plain is the most famous of these limestone landscapes, a flat shelf the size of a small country, lying across the southern edge of the continent in a way that looks, from above, like the Earth is trying to be as uninteresting as possible. Nothing grows very tall there. The land is flat and the sky is large, and the horizon is a very long way away in every direction. But underneath that unremarkable surface, the limestone is riddled with caves, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, counting the small ones, the ones that are barely wide enough for a person to enter, the ones that open into surprisingly large chambers below, and then close again into passages that narrow and narrow until they are too small for anything with a body to follow. The most famous of the Nullarbor blowholes exhale in winter and inhale in summer as the air inside the cave system expands and contracts with the temperature change, breathing with the seasons in a rhythm that has been going on for so long it has become geological. A person who stands over a blowhole and feels that breath on their face feels something they usually cannot name, something that is not quite vertigo and not quite awe, but that partakes of both. The cave system relevant to this story sits further east, in a region of low scrubland and dry creek systems that fill briefly and dramatically after significant rainfall and then return, within a matter of days, to a baked and cracked stillness. The station country in this region is marginal country, the kind that is generous in a good season and quietly punishing in a dry one, managed by families who have been running sheep and cattle on it for generations, and who know it with the kind of detailed, embodied, inherited intimacy that only comes from that depth of occupation. They know where the water runs and where it vanishes into the limestone. They know which parts of the ground are solid and which produce a hollow resonance underfoot, a note slightly lower and slightly emptier than the sound of solid earth. That means the rock below is thin, and below the thin rock there is nothing. They know, as their parents knew and their parents' parents, that the ground in certain places is not entirely to be trusted. The entrance that becomes relevant to this story was known in the area by a colloquial name, the Black Mouth. The name was given in the entirely pragmatic spirit of outback place naming, which tends toward the descriptive and away from the romantic, tends toward what the thing is rather than what it might mean. It was black because the interior was absolutely lightless even in the middle of the brightest day, even when the sun was directly above, and the surrounding landscape was washed white and featureless in the noon glare. The entrance itself was a crack in a limestone shelf at the foot of a low rise, oriented in a way that meant it received no direct sun at any hour. Wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways if they exhaled and committed to it fully, and the drop inside was about 2.5 meters onto a rubble floor of fractured limestone and old flowstone that had been deposited by water in some previous era and had since been left dry, the water having found another path. Below that initial chamber, which was roughly the size of a generous room in a modest house, a series of passages descended through the limestone at irregular angles. Some of them were wide enough to walk through upright. Some required ducking, a constant management of the ceiling, a habit of awareness that underground spaces impose on anyone who spends time in them. Some narrowed to slots that required a person to turn sideways and move with careful, controlled effort, and came out on the other side into spaces that opened again into something the body could move through freely. The passages were irregular. The limestone did not care about human convenience. It had been shaped by water and time, not by any intelligence oriented toward the needs of upright bipeds with lights on their heads and purposes in their minds. The system was not mapped. 2 cavers from Adelaide had entered the upper chambers in the 1980s, documented what they could reach in the time they had, and noted the descending passages in their field notes with a marker that said, essentially, more below, followed by the notation that they had chosen not to follow them further. They had run low on time. They had also noted in the section of their report that described the quality of the air in the lower passages, that the air had a quality they found difficult to describe in purely physical terms. They had tried. They had noted temperature, humidity, movement. All of these were within the normal range for deep cave environments. And then, below that, in the field notes that are more candid than the formal report, one of the 2 wrote that the air felt inhabited, not dangerous, not threatening, simply not empty in the way that uninhabited spaces are empty, as if something was down there, something that was not a geological phenomenon, something that was not them. That was in the 1980s. The notes went into a university filing system. The cave sat in its limestone shelf in the scrubland, and the years went past it in the way that years go past things that are not paying attention to years, which is to say quickly and without leaving any mark. The survey team arrived in the region as part of a biospeleological study, a systematic effort to document the organisms that live out their entire existence in underground darkness, the creatures that have adapted so completely to a world without light that they have lost the biological capacity to exist in any other world. Australia's cave fauna is among the most biologically remarkable on the planet. The continent's geological antiquity and its long isolation from other landmasses have produced cave ecosystems that are, in some systems, unlike anything found anywhere else, the result of evolutionary processes that have been running in the dark, with no input from outside, for spans of time that are difficult to hold in the mind. Species that exist in a single cave system and nowhere else on Earth. Species that have lost their eyes, their pigmentation, their circadian rhythms, their capacity to regulate body temperature independently of the cave environment, because the cave regulates all of those things for them, and they have not needed to do it themselves for millions of years. The survey was an attempt to find and document as much of this as possible before development or drought or the general indifference of the world above the cave changed things below in ways that could not be undone. The survey team had been working the known cave systems in the region for 3 weeks when one of its members, a biologist with a particular sensitivity to airflow in underground environments, the kind of sensitivity that develops in people who spend a lot of time underground and learn to read the movement of air as an indicator of what lies beyond the next wall, found the passage. It was not on any map. It was not referenced in any documentation she had been given before the survey began. It was there, a horizontal slot between 2 shelves of limestone, and through it moved a volume and consistency of air that said something large was connected to it on the other side, something with enough volume to sustain that flow, something more than a dead-end pocket in the rock. She marked it in her field notes with careful precision, photographed the entrance from multiple angles, and returned the following day with the full team and the equipment to follow the passage properly. The team went through the slot. They followed the passages. They followed the sound of water and the movement of air through the lower system, through chambers they had not known existed, past formations they had never seen described in any survey of this region. And they came, in the lower level, around the corner of a passage and into the dome chamber. And the dome chamber contained what it had been containing, in the dark and the cold and the mineral silence, for a very long time. Perhaps longer than any of the words we have for time are comfortable with. Number 2. The first hours after the discovery, and the decisions that had to be made quickly in the dark. The survey team's response to what their lights found in the dome chamber was a stillness. Several of them have described it, separately, and in terms that are consistent enough to suggest the description captures something real, as a particular kind of stillness. Not the stillness of shock, which tends to come with a physical jolt and a sharp narrowing of attention. Not the stillness of fear, which comes with its own particular quality of heightened alertness, the body tightening and preparing for movement. This was a different kind. The kind that comes when the mind recognizes it has arrived in front of something it does not have a framework for, and knows that what is required before anything else is a period of looking, of allowing the thing to be what it is before any attempt is made to categorize it, to name it, to fit it into any of the existing shapes the mind has available for putting new things into. They stood in the entrance to the dome chamber and they looked. Their lights played across the floor, across the walls, across the curve of the ceiling above, and came to rest on what was in the center of the chamber. It was a body. That was the first word that arrived for all of them in the different accounts they have given. Not bones, not remains, a body. Because the word remains implies something scattered, something distributed by time and water, and the various forces that attend to the dead in natural settings. And what was in the center of the dome chamber was not scattered. It was not distributed. It was intact and articulated and arranged in a way that the word remains does not capture and the word body does. Because body implies intention, implies the presence of something complete, implies a shape that was chosen. It lay on its back. The arms were positioned alongside the torso, resting against the sides of the body with the hands placed on the pelvis in the specific, deliberate way of hands that have been placed there by other hands that knew what they were doing. The legs were extended, parallel, the feet crossed at the ankle in a posture that every human tradition of deliberate burial recognizes, and that the dome chamber had preserved in its cold and dark, as if no time at all had passed since the moment the last hands withdrew, and the last footsteps moved back through the narrow passages toward the surface. The skull was oriented away from the entrance to the chamber. The survey team, standing at the entrance, were looking at the back of the skull, at the dome of a cranium that was visible even at that distance as proportionally larger than a human cranium. A dome that was fuller and rounder, and more expansive than the human skull, subtly but unmistakably so, in the way that things can be different in ways that the eye registers before the mind has the language to describe them. A dark organic material surrounded the lower portion of the body. It had the texture of something that had once been constructed, once been made from individual strands that had been compressed over time into a consolidated mass. It followed the outline of the body too closely to be accidental, too consistently to be the result of any kind of random deposition. It had been placed there, along with the body it surrounded, by hands that had known how to prepare material for this purpose. The team leader's decisions in those first minutes were rapid and instinctive in the way of deep professional training. Do not approach the remains, document from where you stand. Leave without disturbing anything. Make the calls that the law and the protocols require, in the order those protocols specify. The first call was to the university. The photographs from the initial documentation went with that call. Transmitted as the team made their way back to the surface, back through the passages, back through the slot in the limestone, and out into the sunlight that felt, several team members have said, strange after the dome chamber. Too bright, too ordinary, too much of the surface world and not enough of the other thing, the thing they had just been in the presence of. The response from the university was measured and appropriate and generated an immediate internal escalation that was also appropriate. The photographs were passed along. Experts were consulted. The morphology of what was visible in the photographs was discussed in terms that quickly made clear to everyone involved that the normal frameworks were not going to be immediately useful here. The call to the South Australian Museum generated a response that was the first specific indication that this would not proceed through the normal channels of scientific discovery. The museum's response, after viewing the photographs, was to express uncertainty about whether this constituted a human remain situation. The morphology, they said, was consistent with a large primate. But Australia has no native non-human primates. It has not had any for millions of years. There had been great apes tens of millions of years ago in Australia's Gondwanan past, but nothing since. So either someone had carried a large primate, dead, into a closed cave system and arranged it with extraordinary deliberate care, which was an explanation that satisfied no one who considered it seriously, or what was in the dome chamber was something that required a genuinely different kind of response. The call to the government authority produced the detail that the survey team found most difficult to characterize. A delay, described by one team member as strange, followed by an instruction that was calm and clear and careful, and that gave, at the same time, very little actual information. Document what you have found, exit the cave, keep the location confidential, await contact. No agency named, no timeline given. The team was thanked. They went back to the surface and they waited. The dome chamber was below them in the dark, and the body was in it, where it had been remaining, for whatever period of time the dark had been keeping it. And the surface world, with its sunlight and its procedures and its phone calls and its strange polite instructions, moved around the survey team like water around something that has suddenly stopped moving. Number 3, the formal examination and what 3 days in the dome chamber revealed. The joint examination team that arrived some weeks later was composed of representatives from the university and the South Australian Museum, and 2 individuals whose institutional affiliation was given in terms that satisfied the administrative requirements of the situation, without answering the direct question of what institution they represented or who had sent them. The survey team lead raised this question once, informally, during the logistics meeting that preceded the first entry to the cave. The answer she received was, she has said, technically responsive. She noted it in her personal records and continued with the work, because the work was what mattered, and the alternative was to not be part of it, which was not acceptable. Access to the cave was controlled and logged from the first day. The dome chamber was treated as a site of the highest significance from the beginning, which meant that the protocols applied were the most protective available. The chamber was documented systematically before any contact was made with the remains. Photographs at every distance and angle and under every available light condition. A photogrammetric survey that used multiple overlapping images to construct a 3-dimensional digital model of the chamber and its contents, precise enough that measurements could be taken from the model without additional disturbance to the site. A detailed mapping of the floor, the walls, the ceiling, the position of every element of the skeleton relative to the chamber's geometry. The dark organic material surrounding the lower skeleton was sampled on the first day, with tools sterilized on site and samples sealed immediately in conditions designed to preserve whatever chemistry remained for dating and analysis. The sample sites were chosen to minimize disturbance to the overall structure while maximizing the information retrievable from the material. A small crawler robot, the kind used in environments where large equipment cannot go and where the stakes of a mistake are too high to accept the risks of human movement in a confined space, was deployed to document surfaces and features that the examination team could not directly access without disturbing the specimen. The bones were not touched on the first day, not on the second day. The examination team worked in the dome chamber for 2 full days, using only their eyes and their lenses and their lights and the various remote documentation tools available to them, building the most complete non-contact record possible before any element of the skeleton was moved or sampled. This was not unusual for a find of this significance. It was careful, it was respectful, in the way that scientists who understand the irreversibility of disturbing a site of this age are careful and respectful of the record they are about to change. The atmosphere in the dome chamber across those 3 days is something that multiple examination team members have described in terms that are, considered together, too consistent to be coincidental. The chamber was not frightening. Nobody on the examination team described it as frightening. Nobody described feeling threatened or unsafe or oppressed by the weight of the stone above them, which is a common feeling in underground spaces, and which the team members, most of whom had significant experience in caves, knew well and would have recognized. What they described was something different. A sense of weight that was not physical. A sense of presence that was not threatening but was also not neutral. Was not the neutral presence of empty geological space. Several team members used independently a word that is not a scientific concept and cannot appear in a formal report. They said the chamber felt inhabited, not in the way that it contained something alive. In the way that it was still, in some sense that they could not fully articulate, being occupied. As if the thing that had been placed there had not entirely left, or as if the placing itself had infused the space with something that the cold stone had preserved along with the bones. None of them wrote this in their reports. They have said it privately in the years since to people they trusted, and they say it with a consistency that makes it worth repeating here. On the third day, with the full non-contact documentation complete, the examination team began direct work with the remains. Bone by bone, surface by surface, element by element, the skeleton was examined and measured and sampled and recorded. The samples taken for genetic analysis were chosen with extraordinary care, from sites judged most likely to have preserved genetic material in the state required for ancient DNA extraction. Every sample site was documented before the sample was taken and after. Every measurement was taken multiple times by different team members and compared. The process was meticulous and slow and respectful of what it was examining, which is how it should have been. What emerged from those 3 days in the chamber was the beginning of a list, the list of anomalies, the list that grew as the work progressed and as the laboratory results began to return in the weeks and months that followed, into something that defied easy explanation. Number 4, the skull, described in the detail it deserves. The skull is where every story about a found body begins, in the scientific literature and in the human imagination both. The skull is legible. It is the part of the skeleton that the mind can make the most immediate sense of, can look at and find the traces of a face, can read as the record of something that once looked back. The skull carries the brain, and the brain is what makes something a self rather than merely an organism, and the skull's job is to carry and protect and position that self in the world, which is why the skull's architecture is so directly responsive to what the brain requires and to what the world requires of the body, human skulls around. This is the founding fact of human skull morphology, the fact from which everything else proceeds. The cranium, the part that contains the brain, balloons upward and backward into a dome. Not a smooth dome, not a perfect geometric form, but recognizably, unmistakably domed in a way that reflects the extraordinary metabolic investment that the human lineage has made in its brain. The human brain is very large. It is large relative to the body it sits in, large relative to any reasonable expectation for a primate of our body size, large in a way that has required the skull to expand dramatically over the course of our evolutionary history to accommodate it. The skull has expanded, and the dome is the result. The skull from the dome chamber had a cranium. This was immediately clear, immediately visible, even in the first photographs taken from the entrance. A dome, a brain case, the unmistakable architecture of something that had housed a brain of significant size. But the proportions of that dome, relative to the face below it, were not the proportions of any human skull in any reference collection anywhere. They were not within the upper range of human cranial variation. They were not, after measurement, in the same range at all. The brain case was larger. This was not an impression, it was a measurement. The cranial volume, estimated from the external dimensions of the skull using the methods established in physical anthropology, for making this estimation from intact skulls, was beyond the upper limit of any human skull in the literature. Beyond the upper limit of any hominin skull in the literature, including the skulls of archaic humans from populations whose cranial volumes are themselves at the absolute upper end of what the genus Homo has produced. The brain case was simply larger than any skull of which the examination team was aware, in any reference collection they had access to, from any period of human evolutionary history, and the facial bones were correspondingly, proportionally, structurally reduced. The orbits, the bony cavities that contained the eyes, were present and correctly positioned but proportionally smaller relative to the cranium than in any human skull. The cheekbones were present and correctly articulated but delicate in their dimensions relative to the skull's overall size, refined in a way that the word delicate is not too strong for. The nasal bones were present. The jaw was present. All of the architectural elements of a primate face were in their correct positions, but the proportional weight of the face relative to the brain case was inverted from what human skulls show. In a human skull, the face is not small. The face is a substantial and structurally significant part of the skull. In the dome chamber skull, the face was architecturally reduced, pared back, as if whatever evolutionary process had been working on this lineage had decided that the face needed to be only as much face as was absolutely necessary, and had allocated all the remaining structural resource to the brain case. One anatomist on the examination team used the phrase inverted proportional logic in a note in the preliminary internal report. It was the most precise phrase available, and it has stayed with everyone who read that report in the years since. The logic of this skull was not human logic. It was its own logic, consistent with itself, following its own rules. And those rules said more brain, less face. The brow ridge, the supraorbital torus, the shelf of bone above the eye sockets, that is one of the most immediately readable features in the hominin fossil record, was present and substantial. In modern humans, the brow ridge is reduced or absent. In archaic humans, in Homo heidelbergensis and Homo neanderthalensis, it is present in forms that range from moderate to very pronounced. The dome chamber skull's brow was present in a form that the examination team described as belonging to neither of these patterns, as constituting its own variant. It was differentiated, thicker and more structured directly above the orbits, more gracile and refined toward the midline of the skull, producing an architectural effect that read, in photographs, as having a particular quality of presence. A heaviness above the eyes that was not threatening and was not brutish, but was very much there, very much inhabited, the brow of something that looked at the world from behind a significant amount of skull. And that found the world, one might imagine, well within its capacity to comprehend. The occipital bone at the back of the skull had a feature at its lower margin that generated a specific request for comparative analysis to 3 separate institutions with expertise in paleoanthropology. The occipital torus, a ridge of bone at the lower edge of the occipital, is present in archaic human species in forms that vary by population and by individual, and that have been extensively studied and described. It is absent or vestigial in modern humans. In the dome chamber skull, it was present in a form that was, the examining anatomist wrote, substantially more developed than in any hominin in the reference literature, but differently shaped, wrapping slightly around the lower edges of the occipital in a way that created a more complete ridge around the base of the skull than any known hominin demonstrates. Not recognizable as a variant of anything previously described. Recognizable as its own form. The foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull through which the spinal cord passes from the brain to the spine, was positioned forward of where it sits in great ape skulls, but not as far forward as in modern humans. This position is one of the clearest indicators of posture in the skeleton. The further forward the foramen magnum, the more upright the posture, because when the spine enters the skull from directly below rather than from behind, the head balances naturally in an upright forward-facing position without the muscular effort that would otherwise be required. The dome chamber skull's foramen magnum said, clearly and specifically, upright, but not exactly human, bipedal, but on its own terms. The cranial sutures, the seams between the bones of the skull, which fuse progressively with age, were partially fused in a pattern that suggested an adult individual in the middle range of adult life. But the examination team noted the limitation of this estimate carefully. The reference charts for suture fusion age are built from human specimens, and if this skull's sutures fused on a different timeline than human sutures, the age estimate carried an uncertainty that could not be quantified with available data. The age estimate was offered as indicative, not as a conclusion. Number 5, the hands in the detail that the hands require. In primate anatomy, the hand is an archive of evolutionary history and behavioral biography simultaneously. Everything a primate has done across millions of years of becoming what it is has left marks in the hand. The proportions of the individual bones, the angles at which they meet at the joints, the range of motion available at each point of articulation, the shapes of the terminal phalanges where nails or claws are born, the width and depth of the joint surfaces that tell you how much force this hand was built to sustain. All of this is information, specific, readable, comparative information that places a hand in its evolutionary context and describes, with precision, the kind of life it was built to lead. The hands of the specimen from the dome chamber had 5 digits each. This was the first thing noted because 5 digits places a hand immediately in the higher primate group, the group that shares the ancestral 5-digit plan and within which all human relatives are found. The complement of bones in each hand was consistent with what anatomy predicts for that plan. 27 bones per hand. Carpals, metacarpals, proximal phalanges, middle phalanges, distal phalanges. All present. All in their correct anatomical positions relative to one another. All intact in a condition that allowed the examination team to describe the full architecture of each hand without any of the guesswork that missing elements require. But within that familiar architecture, the proportions told a different story. The proximal phalanges, the bones immediately beyond the palm, were shorter than in any human hand. shorter than in any known ape hand, proportionally reduced by a consistent margin across all 4 digits examined, in a way that moved the first joint of each finger significantly closer to the palm than in any reference specimen available to the team. The middle phalanges, the bones between the first and second joints, were correspondingly longer, taking up a proportion of each finger's total length that does not appear in any primate hand on record. The distal phalanges, the terminal bones where the nails attach, were broad and flat in the manner of the higher primates, the manner of things that handle objects rather than tree bark, the manner of nails rather than claws. The result was a finger with a total length within the range of a large human hand, but whose internal geometry was redistributed, rearranged, following a different logic, so that the second joint was the prominent joint, the joint with the greatest range of motion, the joint around which the reaching and the grasping and the fine manipulation organize themselves, rather than the first joint, which is the primary articulation in human finger mechanics. A finger that would have reached differently, that would have extended and curved and closed in a way that no human finger does. That would have been capable of things at the level of fine manipulation that the human hand, built as it is not capable of. The thumb was long. The most diagnostically significant feature of the human hand, in comparative terms, is the opposable thumb. The ability of the thumb to swing across the palm and meet the fingers at their tips, creating the pinch grip that is fundamental to everything that human hands do with objects. The thumb of the dome chamber specimen was longer than the human thumb, significantly longer relative to the other digits, projecting further beyond the plane of the palm when fully extended, articulating with the wrist at an angle that the examination team's analysis indicated would have allowed a range of rotation and lateral reach greater than any human thumb achieves. A thumb that could come further around, that could meet the fingers at more positions, at more angles, with more of the palm available for contact. A thumb built for doing things with great reach and great precision simultaneously. The nail beds, the depressions in the terminal phalanges from which nails grow, were broad and flat. Whatever this was, it kept nails. Flat, spatulate nails, the nails of something that handled things with care and did not need the grip enhancement that claws provide. The nails of something that managed the world it lived in through dexterity rather than force. The size of the hands was consistent with the overall size of the skeleton, large, significantly larger than a human hand, in the way that everything about this specimen was significantly larger than its human equivalent, but not disproportionate to the frame they belonged to. Against the skeleton, the hands were correct. It was only when you held them against the known primate record, measured them against the reference library of what hands have been in the primate lineage, that they became the specific, detailed, unanswerable question they are. Hands built for making. That is the phrase that the examination team's anatomist used in the informal conversation that followed the first day of direct work with the bones, the conversation that happened over food and rest after the work was done, the conversation that tends to be more honest than the reports that are written later. Hands built for making. The specific architecture of precision and reach that you find in hands that are going to make things, that are going to take materials and work them into forms they could not reach alone, that are going to hold needles and awls and spindles and the implements of production that require, above all other things, the specific combination of reach and control and feeling that these hands, in their particular proportional arrangement, would have had in abundance. Number 6, the skeleton as a whole, and the story it told about how this being moved through the living world. A skeleton is a life record, not the kind of record that memory is, not the kind that narrative is, not the kind that images are. A different kind, a record written by the body itself, in calcium, across the entire span of a life lived in a particular way in a particular place. The wear on a joint records direction and frequency of movement. The density of bone records, the demands that muscle and gravity and load placed on it across the years. The healed fractures in long bones record what happened once and what the body survived. And the overall architecture of the skeleton, the angles and proportions and curves that are established before birth and maintained through life, records something more fundamental than any of those individual signatures. It records the design, the form of the existence this body was built to inhabit. The skeleton from the dome chamber told a story that the examination team spent weeks constructing and that they were not certain. At the end of their examination period, they had fully understood. Some parts of the story were legible. Some parts were in a language that the reference literature they were working from did not fully equip them to read. The spine was the structure they examined first, after the skull and the hands, because the spine is the axis around which everything else in the vertebrate body organizes itself. Its curvature determines posture and gait, and the position of the head and the distribution of forces through the entire musculoskeletal system. Get the spine right and you understand the body. Get it wrong and nothing else makes sense. Human spines have 4 curves. This is one of the most carefully studied and consistently documented features of human anatomy, because those 4 curves are what make upright bipedal locomotion mechanically possible, what allow the human body to walk and run on 2 legs without either falling forward or sustaining catastrophic spinal injury. What positioned the heavy human head over the body's center of gravity in a way that makes standing still a passive act rather than a constant muscular effort? The four curves are a signature of the human body. They are what human spines have. The spine from the dome chamber had 5 curves. The fifth curve was in the lower thoracic region, the transition zone between the rib-bearing thoracic spine and the lumbar spine below, the part of the back that a person reaches for when they say their back is sore, the region where a great deal of human postural strain accumulates. It was slight, it was not a dramatic departure. Looking at the photographs of the spine in situ, it would be possible to miss it if you were not looking for it. But once the examination team identified it, its consistency was undeniable. Present in every image. Symmetric, meaning it was the same on both sides of the vertebral column, which is the most fundamental criterion for distinguishing a structural feature from a pathological one. Showing none of the bone changes that accompany the structural conditions that cause additional curvature in living human spines. A feature, not a deformity, part of the design. The examination team built a computational model of the skeleton from the measurements they had taken, assigning to the digital skeleton the proportions and the architectural features that the bones described, and ran that model through simulations of bipedal locomotion. The purpose was to understand what a spine with this architecture, in a body with this size and these proportions, would produce in terms of gait and posture. The simulations required assumptions about soft tissue and musculature that the bones alone could not supply, and those assumptions introduced uncertainty into the results. But the results were consistent enough across the range of assumptions tested to suggest something with reasonable confidence. What the 5-curved spine produced in a body of this size and proportion was a bipedal gait, upright, two-legged, the fundamental mechanical signature of a creature that stood erect and walked on its back legs and held its arms free of the ground, but with a center of gravity positioned slightly further back in the body than the human center of gravity, producing a gait that was more vertical in the torso, less of the forward momentum transfer that characterizes human walking, more self-contained, more deliberate. A body that walked as if the ground was not going anywhere, and neither was it. That moved through the world with the particular quality of unhurriedness that belongs to things that are not pursued and do not pursue, that are simply going somewhere at their own pace in their own time. The long bones of the limbs were dense. This was one of the most consistent and most commented upon findings of the examination, across all the various analyses applied to the skeleton. The cortical bone, the hard outer shell of the femur, and the tibia and the humerus was measurably and significantly thicker than in human long bones of comparable length. The internal architecture was more compact, less of the open cancellous lattice that human long bones use to achieve their combination of lightness and structural strength, more of a dense, closely organized internal structure that sacrificed the lightness in favor of an increased resistance to fracture and mechanical failure. Bones like this, in a living body, would have been heavy in the hand. They would have required substantial muscle mass to move. They would have been extraordinarily resistant to the kinds of forces that break human bones. They would have made this body, whatever this body was, substantially heavier than a human of equivalent height. Not just taller, denser, more solid, more present in the physical sense. The ribcage was broader and deeper than a human thorax of comparable overall body size. Proportionally, the chest cavity was larger, suggesting internal organs of proportionally greater size, lungs with more capacity, a heart with more volume, a respiratory and circulatory system with reserves that a human system does not have. What this means for the physical endurance of this creature, for the amount of sustained metabolic effort it could sustain before fatigue imposed its limits, cannot be calculated from the bones alone. But the architecture suggests a body with significant reserves, a body built for the long effort rather than the sudden one. The pelvis was broad and deep, consistent with the upright bipedal posture that the spine and the leg bones confirmed. The architecture of the hip joint was human-like in its orientation, the head of the femur facing upward and inward in the way of bipedal pelvises rather than sideways in the way of quadrupedal ones. A creature that stood on 2 legs and had been standing on 2 legs for long enough that its pelvis had fully committed to the architecture that upright walking requires, that had left behind whatever earlier posture its lineage might have had and was now, in the specificity of its pelvic structure, entirely and irreversibly an upright being. The sternum was long. The longest human sternum in the available reference literature did not match the length of the sternum from the dome chamber, even after accounting for the overall size difference between the specimen and any human individual. It had an additional bony element at its lower end, below the xiphoid process where the human sternum terminates. A small, distinct, anatomically positioned element that articulated with the surrounding cartilaginous structures in a way that suggested it served a specific function in the thoracic architecture. The examining anatomist described it as having no known equivalent in any primate species in any reference collection. It was a bone without a name because nothing in the established record had ever needed to name it. Number 7, the DNA and the particular quality of the answer it gave. Every mystery of biological identity in this era is supposed to eventually resolve into a question of genetics. This is not an overstatement of the power of genomic science. It is an accurate description of what that science can do and has done and continues to do in contexts that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. Ancient DNA has been extracted from organisms dead for hundreds of thousands of years. The genome of the Neanderthal has been sequenced from bone fragments recovered from caves in Germany and Croatia and Gibraltar. The genome of the Denisovan, a population of archaic humans known from a fingertip bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave, has been sequenced in enough detail to reveal that this group interbred with modern human ancestors and left genetic traces in the populations of modern humans who live today in parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The tools for recovering, sequencing, and interpreting ancient genetic material are extraordinary and are becoming more extraordinary with each passing year. The samples taken from the dome chamber remains were processed with every precaution that the examination team could apply. The selection of sample sites was careful and specific, choosing bone locations that the team's assessment of the specimen's preservation history suggested were most likely to have retained genetic material in a usable state. The samples were taken in conditions designed to minimize contamination, processed in cleanroom facilities, and analyzed using the ancient DNA protocols developed specifically for fragmented material recovered from long-term depositional environments. These protocols are designed for exactly this situation, and they work. They have recovered readable genetic material from material far older and far less well preserved than the dome chamber specimen appeared to be. The extraction worked. This was, in itself, a significant piece of information about the cave environment. The preservation of genetic material in bone is strongly dependent on temperature stability, humidity control, and the absence of the oxidative processes that break DNA down over time. The cave had provided all of these things. The temperature in the lower system was measured as constant, within the narrow band that ancient DNA preservation requires. The humidity was regulated by the stone itself. The sealed, dark, stable environment of the dome chamber had functioned, for whatever span of time the body had been there, as a preservation system more effective than most that human technology has deliberately designed. Multiple laboratories received samples, each processed them independently. Each returned results using multiple sequencing approaches. And when the results were compared, they were consistent with one another in a way that ruled out contamination or processing error as explanations for what they showed, because contamination and processing error produce inconsistency, and the results from these laboratories were not inconsistent. They agreed. What they agreed on was this: the genome recovered from the dome chamber specimen was not human. The sequence divergence from modern human DNA was not within any range that could be attributed to individual variation or to population-level genetic difference, or to any of the normal sources of genomic diversity within the human species. The divergence was categorical. This was not a human body, not a body that shared any recent common ancestor with modern humans in any sense that the word recent can reasonably be stretched to cover. It was also not consistent with any other known species in any genomic reference database anywhere in the world. Not any known primate, not any known mammal, not any organism that has been sampled and sequenced and entered into the accumulated genetic record that molecular biology has assembled across its decades of work. The closest matches, the genomic sequences from other organisms that shared the most similarity with what had been recovered, were recognizably mammalian in their broad architecture. The genes were genes. The molecular machinery was recognizable as belonging to the same broad tradition as the other mammals of this planet, but the specific content, the particular arrangements, the detailed sequence that determines everything specific about an organism, placed this specimen at a distance from everything in the database that had no comfortable position in any established model of primate or mammalian evolution. The molecular clock analysis was where the most significant and most sobering finding emerged. The molecular clock is the concept, supported by extensive empirical evidence, that DNA sequences diverge from one another at an approximately constant rate over evolutionary time, and that by measuring how different two sequences are from one another, you can estimate how long ago the lineages they represent shared a common ancestor. It is not a perfect clock. Rates vary between lineages and between different parts of the genome, but it is calibrated against a large body of evidence from organisms whose divergence times are also known from the fossil record, and its estimates for well-characterized lineages are reliable. For the dome chamber specimen, the molecular clock suggested a divergence from the line leading to modern humans that was significantly deeper in time than the divergence of any recognized hominin. The Neanderthal divergence from the modern human line is estimated at roughly 500,000 years ago. The Denisovan divergence is estimated at similar or slightly greater depth. These are the numbers for the most recently diverged members of the human family. The dome chamber specimen's divergence estimate was greater than those, in a range that, if it is correct, places the common ancestor of this lineage and the modern human line at a point earlier than any human relative recognized by current paleoanthropology. A lineage that was separate from the line leading to modern humans for longer than any known human relative has been separate. a lineage with its own deep history, its own evolutionary trajectory, its own long sequence of generations in which it became what the dome chamber revealed it to be, something that had been doing its own evolutionary work for a very long time, and nobody had known. Number 8, the teeth and the specific story they carry about a long and particular life. Teeth survive. This is one of the most fundamental facts of paleontology and forensic science both, and it is a fact that shapes the entire record of life's history in ways that are easy to underestimate. The hardest biological material that vertebrates produce, more resistant to the chemistry of decay than bone, more resistant to the physical forces of geological process, more resistant to time in almost every environment in which organisms die and are incorporated into the record of the past. Paleontologists have reconstructed entire species from a single tooth. Forensic specialists have identified individual people from a tooth found at a scene when nothing else remained. The tooth is the record that persists when all other records have been lost. The specimen from the dome chamber had 32 teeth. This number was, when it was counted by the examination team, one of the very few features of the specimen's anatomy that aligned cleanly and without qualification alongside modern humans. The standard adult human dental complement is 32 teeth, assuming all 4/3 molars are present, and 32 was the count here, arranged in the two arcades of upper and lower jaws that primate dentition organizes itself into in the sequence of incisors, canines, premolars, and molars that the primate dental formula specifies for this part of the mammalian dental spectrum. But within that number, in those positions, the individual teeth told a story that was entirely their own. The incisors were larger than in human dentition, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visually striking at first glance, but measurably, consistently larger in their dimensions, with a cutting edge that was slightly curved in a way that no human incisor replicates, a backward curve that would have modified the shearing geometry of the initial bite. The way the teeth first engage with food, in a way that is specific and functional and not accidental. Teeth are not accidental. Everything about their shape is a response to something. The curve in the cutting edge of these incisors was a response to something in the dietary history of this lineage, something that required a slightly different initial processing action, something that rewarded the particular shearing geometry this curvature produces over the alternatives. The canines were intermediate in their expression, neither the extended projecting canines of the great apes nor the fully reduced, near incisor level canines of modern humans. A compromise position, a point in between, which means a lineage that had been moving, evolutionarily, in the direction of canine reduction but had not arrived at the terminal reduction that modern humans show. A lineage at a different point on the trajectory, not where the apes are and not where the humans are, but on the path between them, at its own position. The posterior teeth, the premolars and molars that do the sustained heavy work of food processing, were where the dental record departed most significantly from any available reference. The occlusal surface pattern, the arrangement of cusps and basins and ridges on the grinding surfaces that meet when the jaws close, was organized differently than in any primate tooth the examination team could locate a reference for. The Y5 pattern, the specific cusp arrangement that defines the great apes and humans as a group, and that has been a standard diagnostic tool in primate paleontology for decades, was not present. A different pattern was present, one that was consistent in its arrangement across all of the posterior teeth examined, that followed its own logic, that organized the occlusal surface in a way that would have produced different grinding mechanics, different patterns of food breakdown, different wear over time. The wear was heavy and informative. The wear across the molar surfaces was distributed in a pattern consistent with a diet that required sustained masticatory effort. Not soft food, not easily processed material, but food that resisted, that required the jaw to work, to sustain occlusal force over time. The distribution of the wear across different parts of the molar surface suggested omnivory, a diet that included materials processed differently, that taxed the dentition in different directions, that required the full range of what these teeth were built to do, not a specialist, something that ate a variety of things and that had teeth built for that variety. The enamel, examined under electron microscopy during the laboratory phase of the analysis, was thicker than in any human tooth in the reference collection, measurably, significantly, categorically thicker, and its crystalline microstructure was differently organized at the microscopic scale, more tightly packed, more regularly aligned in its crystal orientation, in a configuration that represented a degree of crystalline order beyond what is observed in human enamel. Harder teeth, more resistant to physical force, more resistant to the acids that cause dental decay. Teeth built for a very long use, and they had been used. The wear on the surfaces of these teeth spoke of a life of eating, of sustained dietary processing across many years, of a jaw that had closed and ground and worked day after day for the span of an adult life that the suture fusion evidence suggested was somewhere in the middle range. Teeth used long, in a body built for long use, in a world that the teeth suggest was varied and demanding and met with the full resources of a dentition that had been built by whatever evolutionary pressures shaped this lineage to handle all of it. Number 9. The textile that surrounded the body and what its survival in the dark says. Return to the dark organic material. The substance that was noted in the first survey, described in the initial reports with the careful, non-interpretive language of field documentation. The substance that surrounded the lower portion of the skeleton and had, across whatever span of time had passed since the body was placed in the dome chamber, partially encased the bones it had been arranged around, hardened into the shape of the wrapping it had once been, become part of the context of the body's presence in the chamber in a way that was inseparable from that presence. It was dark. This was its most immediately apparent visual quality, in the photographs and in the direct examination. A deep, rich, absorptive brown-black, the color of very old wood or of aged peat, of organic material that has been in darkness for a very long time, and has undergone the chemical transformations that time and anaerobic conditions produce in plant-based material. It absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In the darkness of the dome chamber, where the examination team's lights were the only light, it was the quality of the material's relationship to light that was most immediately legible. It drank the light, it gave nothing back, it was structured. Its distribution around the body followed the outline of the skeleton too precisely, too consistently, with too little of the randomness that any kind of natural deposition produces, to be the result of anything other than placement. It was not sediment that had accumulated around the bones from the movement of water or the settling of fine particles from the cave air. It was not the result of any geological process the examination team could identify. It was arranged, it had been arranged. It followed the outline of the body it surrounded in a way that spoke of hands that had placed it there deliberately, that had arranged it around the body with intention and care, that had done this as part of a process that had a meaning and a purpose that went beyond the merely practical. The laboratory analysis of the samples was conducted across multiple specialist disciplines because the material was complex enough that no single discipline could address all of its aspects. The botanical analysis identified plant fibers, multiple species, not all of them native to the immediate vicinity of the cave, a finding that was noted and discussed, and that implied a range of movement or a network of resource access that extended across a significant area. The fibers had been processed, the botanical and materials analysts agreed, not simply gathered and placed. Processed, subjected to a treatment consistent with retting or an equivalent preparatory process that loosens the cellulose fibers within plant material, separates them from the surrounding cellular structure, makes them workable in the specific sense that textile production requires. The fibers had been prepared as a craftsperson prepares raw material before working it, with the knowledge and the time that preparation requires, and then they had been made into something. The textile specialists who examined the samples were working with material that had been compressed and consolidated and chemically altered over tens of thousands of years of existence in a limestone cave. They were working, in other words, with what remained of something that had once been different, without access to the thing itself in its original state. This is always the condition of archaeological textile analysis, and skilled practitioners work within it effectively, recovering from the compressed and altered remains of ancient textiles the evidence of their original construction that the laws of materials science preserve even when the obvious visual qualities have long since disappeared. What they found was a large, thick textile object, not a thin sheet, not a simple mat. A substantial, layered, produced object, large enough to have enclosed the lower half of the body that was found within its remains, constructed from the prepared plant fibers in a way that demonstrated, unambiguously, technical skill, not crude skill, not the first attempt at a technology still being developed. The kind of skill that comes from knowing what you are doing, from having done it before, from belonging to a tradition in which this knowledge has been tested and refined and passed from one practitioner to the next, until the practitioners who carry it can do it well. The specific construction technique was not recoverable in its details from what remained. The compression and the chemical transformation of thousands of years were too extensive. But the materials specialists could say, with confidence, that the fibers had been worked rather than simply layered, that the construction had involved some form of interlinking or interworking of the fibers rather than simple stacking, and that the resulting structure had, in its original state, possessed the kind of integrity and coherence that distinguishes a made textile from an accumulation of plant material. The plant species represented in the fibers included several with known fiber-producing properties, species whose inner bark or leaf material has been used for cordage and textile production in various traditions across Australia and the Pacific. But the specific combination of species and the specific processing and construction method evidenced in the remains of the textile did not correspond to any tradition documented in the ethnographic or archaeological literature. It was its own tradition, the tradition of whoever made this, whoever had learned to make this, whoever had taught and been taught across however many generations had carried this knowledge forward, from the first time someone in this lineage looked at a plant and understood that it could be unmade and remade into something that a body could be wrapped in for the long dark, the dating. The dating was one of the most carefully discussed and most carefully qualified aspects of the entire examination, and for good reason, because the dates produced by the various methods applied to the textile and the surrounding sediment and the overlying geological deposits were the dates that placed everything else in a context that made the already extraordinary nature of the discovery considerably more extraordinary. The radiocarbon dates from organic material in the textile placed it within a range of age that the uncertainty inherent in radiocarbon dating of samples of this age expressed as a wide but bounded interval. The uranium series dates from the flowstone that had deposited itself over the lowest layer of the organic material. The flowstone that could not have deposited after the textile was placed because the textile was beneath it gave a minimum age for the deposition. The optically stimulated luminescence dates from fine sediment interbedded with the organic layer gave a constraint of a different kind. Together, and read conservatively, these three independent lines of dating evidence were consistent with an age for the body and its textile wrapping in the range of 20 to 30,000 years, with certain of the individual dates suggesting the possibility of an age considerably greater. 20,000 years at the minimum, 30,000 years, conservatively, placed in the dome chamber at a time when the geological and archaeological record of Australia looks, to the best of current knowledge, very different from what these dates imply it should contain. Number 10. The drawings in the adjacent chamber, and the figure that everyone saw and nobody initially spoke about. Through the far wall of the dome chamber, beyond the area where the examination team had been working for 2 days, there was a passage. It was narrow, requiring careful navigation, requiring the kind of attentive, body-aware movement that tight cave passages impose on anyone who goes through them. The examination team had noted it on the first day, and had designated it for documentation, and on the second day they entered it. The passage led in the way of cave passages, first narrower and then wider, and then into a small chamber, and then through another connecting tube into a second chamber. The first additional chamber was geological, formations that were beautiful and scientifically interesting, and not directly relevant to the question of the dome chamber remains. The team documented it and moved on. The second additional chamber had drawings on its walls. 4 surfaces, 3 limestone walls and a large flat boulder that had fallen from the ceiling at some geological point in the past and come to rest at an angle, its tilted face exposed to the chamber space, creating a surface that caught the examination team's lights in a way that made the drawings on it immediately visible from the moment they entered. Ochre. All of it was made in ochre, the iron-rich mineral pigment that is the oldest continuously used artistic medium in Australian prehistory, found at sites across the continent, in use for at least 65,000 years. The red and orange medium through which one of the oldest artistic traditions in human history has expressed itself and maintained its expression across a span of time that makes every other continuous artistic tradition in the world look brief. The rock art specialists on the examination team were experienced. They had worked with Australian rock art at many sites and were familiar with the tradition's visual language, its conventions and its variations, its range of subjects and its range of styles across different regions and different periods. They knew how to look at this kind of material and what to look for, and they knew, crucially, how to resist the temptation of overinterpretation, the tendency to read into rock art what you want to see rather than what is there. Most of the figures on 3 of the 4 surfaces were within the range of what they recognized. Animals, human figures in conventional postures, geometric marks, the visual language of a tradition they had encountered before, in different forms and different contexts, but recognizable as belonging to the same broad tradition. They documented it carefully and without rushing to interpretation, because the tradition deserves that care. The 4th surface, the wall directly opposite the passage entry, was different. The figures on that wall were large, larger than the figures on the other surfaces, rendered at a scale that suggested they were meant to be seen from across the chamber, that their size was not incidental but chosen. They were bipedal, clearly and unambiguously bipedal, rendered in postures that were specific and consistent across several figures, postures that the rock art specialist, in her preliminary notes, described as carrying postures, figures bearing something, holding something, the arms positioned in the particular way of bodies that are holding weight and distributing it. The lines that rendered them were confident and sure, not tentative, not exploratory. The lines of someone who had done this before and who knew the figure well enough to render it without hesitation. Their proportions were not the proportions of human figures. In Australian rock art, human figures have a characteristic proportional vocabulary. The relationship between the length of the torso and the length of the legs, between the width of the shoulders and the narrowness of the hips in the most common stylizations, between the size of the head and the overall body length. These things vary by region and by period and by individual artistic convention, but they vary within a range. The figures on this wall were outside that range. The cranium relative to the body was larger, the torso was longer relative to the legs, the arms were longer relative to the torso. The proportions were consistent across all the large figures on that surface, following their own logic, their own conventions, which were not the conventions of any human figure tradition the specialist could place. She noted this in her preliminary report. She described the figures as unusual. She recommended comparative analysis. She moved to the next surface and documented it with the same methodical care she had brought to everything else. The photographs were in the record. Weeks later, when the measurements from the dome chamber skeleton were available in digital form, and a digital model of the specimen had been constructed from those measurements, the proportional outline of the dome chamber specimen was overlaid on the proportional outline of the large figures on the cave wall. This comparison was performed, as far as the documentation shows, informally, by a graduate student working with the project data after hours, motivated by a question that the photographs had planted, and that the formal documentation schedule did not include time to address. The comparison appears in the project record as a supplementary note, brief, without interpretation, consisting primarily of the overlaid images and a measurement of the correspondence between the proportional outlines. The correspondence was close. Whatever was on the cave wall had been drawn by hands that knew the thing in the dome chamber, had known it well enough to render it at scale, in confident ochre strokes, on a wall in a chamber adjacent to where it lay, had placed between the image and the body the narrow passage of limestone that separated those two spaces, the passage through which the body had to have been carried at the beginning of its time in the dome chamber, and through which the hands that made the drawings had moved back and forth between the drawing and the dead. They had drawn it, and then they had left. And both the drawing and the body had remained in the dark for 20,000 years, or 30 or more. Number 11. The Aboriginal knowledge systems that carried this forward and what they preserved. Australia has the oldest continuous living culture on Earth. This is not a metaphor. It is not an expression of poetic respect, though respect is certainly warranted. It is a literal, empirically supported description of what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this continent have maintained across 65,000 years of continuous occupation, adaptation, and cultural transmission. 65,000 years of knowledge, carried in language and ceremony and story, and the detailed ecological understanding that allows a person to navigate and live within a landscape that would be lethal to someone who did not know it. 65,000 years of a living archive. That archive is not separate from the scientific record of Australia's past. It is part of it. It is, in many cases, the most detailed and the most specific part of it, the part that preserves information that the geological and archaeological record has not been able to preserve on its own. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians carry accounts of events that Western science has subsequently corroborated, accounts of sea level rise that match the geological record of coastal inundation, accounts of volcanic eruptions that match the eruption dates determined by other methods, accounts of the existence and behavior of species that Western science classified as extinct and then found, through renewed fieldwork or the expansion of the survey area, were not extinct after all. The knowledge systems carry this information not because they are repositories of received mythology, not in any sense that diminishes or mischaracterizes what they are, but because they are living knowledge systems, maintained by the same rigorous processes of testing, transmission, and refinement that all knowledge systems use, adapted to the specific conditions of an oral tradition, and powerful enough in those adaptations to carry specific empirical information across spans of time that written record has never matched. The Adnyamathanha people are the traditional custodians of the country in which the cave is located. Their connection to this land is deep, specific, and carefully maintained. The consultation that followed the cave discovery involved senior knowledge holders, who were willing to engage with the academic researchers on terms that the community established, sharing what they chose to share in the forms they chose to share it. The researchers involved in the consultation have spoken of it with considerable care, aware of the weight of what was entrusted to them and aware that what they were permitted to record is a small portion of what was shared. What the community confirmed in the consultation was that the cave was known to their tradition, not as an active ceremonial site in recent memory, not as a place that people went in the recent period, but known in the tradition, named, placed in the network of knowledge about this country that the tradition maintains. The name shared, which the community noted, was not the full name or the full cultural context, but an appropriate portion of it for the purposes of this engagement. Referred to something that translates in English toward the concepts of keeping, of remaining, of something that waits. A keeper place. A place where something remains. The knowledge tradition also carried, in the accounts that were shared in appropriate form, references to beings in this country who were not human and who were not represented in any Western zoological or anthropological record. The tradition is careful about how and when and to whom this knowledge is shared, for reasons that are the tradition's own reasons, and that the consulting researchers respected. What was shared in the spirit of a particular kind of engagement, the kind that the discovery seemed to call for, the kind that the physical evidence in the cave seemed to demand. The beings described in the relevant accounts were tall, proportionally different from humans, moving through the landscape in ways that the accounts characterize not as threatening or as supernatural in any way that the tradition itself would recognize as supernatural, but as appropriate to themselves, as right for what they were, as the movement of beings with their own claim on this country and their own relationship to it. The accounts described a coexistence with protocols, things that were understood, obligations that went in both directions, which places were shared and how, what was owed when one of these beings died. The specific obligation described in the accounts, the obligation to carry the dead to appropriate places, to arrange them, to provide for them the materials of preparation, was the detail that every member of the academic consultation team noted separately when they were asked afterward what had stayed with them. The obligation to place the dead, to prepare them, to do this with care and with knowledge. A body was placed in a keeper place, by hands that understood the obligation, who knew what was owed, and the keeper place kept it for 20,000 years or more, until the lights came through the slot in the limestone and found it. Number 12. The silence that followed the examination and what the shape of that silence says. Science makes itself public. This is definitional, not incidental. The results of scientific inquiry are supposed to move from the laboratory through the literature into the broader understanding that constitutes a society's knowledge of the world. This movement is what makes science science rather than private expertise. It is the mechanism through which scientific knowledge accumulates, through which errors are corrected, through which the work of one team becomes available to the next team, through which the picture of reality becomes, over time and through sustained collective effort, more detailed and more accurate. Remove the movement and you remove the science. What remains is a collection, however well maintained. And collections, however carefully curated, cannot answer questions the way science is designed to answer them. The findings from the dome chamber examination have not moved through those channels in the way that a discovery of this significance should move. The papers have not been published, the museum exhibition has not been announced and has not opened. The documentary, the press conference, the curriculum update, the textbook revision. The public communication of any kind from any institution that would acknowledge, in any public forum, what was found in the lower system of the cave and what the analysis of it produced. None of these things have happened. The discovery, by every institutional metric available, has not been made. The researchers who were there have continued their careers. Some have moved into different research areas. Some have stayed in the same areas but have not published on the cave. When asked in the various forms that asking takes, when the person being asked is a working scientist with institutional affiliations and professional reputations to maintain, they respond in ways that are careful and measured, and that in their carefulness say something. The careful response is itself a kind of communication. When people who have found extraordinary things speak carefully about them, the carefulness is not absence of information. It is information of a particular kind. The institutional records produced by the examination, the reports compiled by the university and the museum, the documentation generated by the formal examination process, are not publicly accessible. Their existence has been confirmed by people who were part of the process. What they contain, what their conclusions were, what recommendations they made, is not known outside the small circle of people who have seen them. Freedom of information requests have been processed and have returned, in some cases, heavily redacted documents, and in other cases, advice that the requested materials do not fall within the scope of the relevant legislation, which is a specific and important distinction that tells you something about which legislative category the institutions have placed these materials in. The two individuals whose institutional affiliation was never clearly established to the satisfaction of the survey team have not been identified in any public record associated with the case. They were present, they are in some of the photographs taken during the examination period. They had the correct documentation for every aspect of the process they were involved in, and they are not named in any public document. What explains this? The honest answer is that the most dramatic explanations are the least likely ones. Institutions are not good at dramatic conspiracies. They are very good at something else, something more mundane and more common, which is paralysis. The paralysis that comes when an institution encounters something that does not fit its existing categories, and genuinely does not know how to proceed. You cannot publish a paper on something you cannot classify. You cannot design a museum exhibition around a specimen that resists the labels museum exhibitions require. You cannot write a press release about something that you do not have a name for. The machinery of institutional scientific communication requires inputs in specific forms, and the dome chamber specimen arrived in a form the machinery cannot process. And so the machinery stopped, not by decision, not by directive, but by the simple fact that it did not know what to do next. And in the absence of knowing what to do next, the default is to do nothing, to wait, to hold the material in controlled conditions, and to wait for the framework that will allow the next step. The framework has not arrived. The next step has not been taken. The specimen waits. Number 13. The second body and the account that did not enter the formal record. There is a second body. This part of the record is the least formally documented aspect of the case. It comes not from any published paper or official report or accessible institutional archive. It comes from the accounts of individuals who were present during the examination period and who have, in various contexts and in various degrees of completeness, described something that happened during that period that is not reflected in any of the formal documentation that has been produced. The most complete of these accounts comes from a researcher who was part of the examination team, and who has, in a recorded conversation whose existence and contents the researcher has confirmed when asked about them directly, described a discovery made during the third day of formal examination in the cave. A discovery that was not processed through the standard documentation channels. What the researcher described was a second set of remains, found in a passage that opened from the dome chamber in a direction different from the passage that led to the drawings chamber. A shorter passage. A passage that the examination team had noted on the first day, and that was on the documentation schedule for the third day. The researcher was present when this passage was entered, and what it contained was found. The second remains were not as completely preserved as the primary specimen. The passage had received more water movement than the dome chamber over the intervening period, and the water had disturbed the remains, scattered some of the smaller elements, moved things out of their original positions. It was not an intact, articulated skeleton in the way the dome chamber specimen was intact and articulated. It was disturbed, partial, a partial record of what had once been a complete body, but enough remained to allow identification. The cranial fragments that were present had the same proportional quality as the dome chamber skull. The same expanded brain case, the same relatively reduced facial architecture, recognizable as belonging to the same morphological tradition as the primary specimen. The hand bones that were present had the same proportional arrangement. The shortened proximal phalanges, the elongated middle phalanges, the broad nail beds, the long thumb. The long bone fragments had the same dense cortical architecture. The second individual was smaller than the first, significantly smaller, in a way that was not consistent with simple individual variation within an adult population, but was consistent with a difference in developmental stage. The bone surfaces showed the particular features that distinguish juvenile bone from adult bone in the primate skeleton. The researcher's best estimate, based on the developmental features visible in the available material, was that the second individual was young, a juvenile, perhaps an older child, perhaps a young adolescent, in a species whose developmental timeline would need to be understood before any more specific estimate could be offered. A child, laid in a passage adjacent to the dome chamber, in the same keeping place, with the same tradition of placement that had positioned the larger body in the chamber's center. The second remains were removed during the third day, not through the standard chain of custody process that governed the primary specimen. The two individuals whose institutional affiliation had never been clearly stated were present for this removal. Not all of the standard examination team members were present. The destination of the second remains was not communicated to the members of the team who were not present for that stage. The researcher who was given this account was present and witnessed the removal and noted where the second remains went, which was into the care of the two individuals with the unclear affiliation, and into a chain of custody that did not continue through any of the standard institutional documentation processes that the rest of the examination materials had passed through. The researcher has not published this account in any formal form. The standards of formal scientific publication require evidence that can be externally verified, that can be tested by other researchers, that exists in the accessible and replicable form that the scientific record requires. What the researcher has is memory of what they saw, memory that is consistent with itself across every telling, that has not changed in its essential details across the years since the examination. But memory is not publishable. Memory is not data, in the formal sense that science requires. They know what they saw. They cannot prove it in any form the academic record will accept. And so they have told people they trust, carefully and specifically, and the knowledge has moved forward by that route instead of the one that was supposed to be available. Number 14, the weight of what all of this adds up to and the specific question it places in front of us. There is a species on this planet, or there was one, that has no name in any scientific literature. It had hands built for making, for the specific skilled production of things from raw materials, for the textile work that the dark organic material in the dome chamber demonstrates, for whatever other making those hands were capable of, that the archaeological record of this cave does not fully contain. It had a skull whose proportions said, more clearly than any other single feature, that whatever was living behind that face was primarily brain. That the evolutionary process that produced this skull had decided, at some deep moment in this lineage's history, that brain was the priority and that everything else could be reduced to make room for it. It had a genome that does not fit in the genetic record of life on this planet, not because life on this planet is not diverse enough to contain it, but because we have not been paying attention in ways that would have found it. It died in a cave in South Australia. It was placed there by others of its kind who knew what death required of them and who attended to that requirement with skill and care and the specific materials that their knowledge and their hands allowed them to prepare. It was drawn on a cave wall by hands that knew its proportions and rendered them in confident ochre strokes on limestone in a chamber adjacent to where it lay. And the cave kept it in the cold and the dark and the mineral silence of a keeper place for 20,000 years or 30,000 or more, until a survey team looking for blind invertebrates came through a slot in the limestone with lights on their heads and found it. The knowledge tradition of the people who have been custodians of this country for 65,000 years carried the account of this keeping forward, not as legend, not as myth in the dismissive sense that Western frameworks sometimes apply to Indigenous knowledge, but as the specific, tested, transmitted knowledge that 65,000 years of careful maintenance produces. They knew the cave as a keeper place. They knew the obligation to place the dead with care. They preserved, in the forms appropriate to their tradition, the account of a coexistence that the physical evidence in the dome chamber corroborates, and the institutions that received the physical evidence have not shared it. This is the specific situation as it stands, not a dramatic scandal, not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. Something quieter and in its own way more troubling. The ordinary failure mode of institutional science when it encounters something outside its existing frameworks. The paralysis of not knowing what to do next. The holding pattern that becomes, through inertia and through the passage of time, the default state. The gradual accumulation of a silence around a discovery that deserved loudness, that deserved the full engagement of every discipline with something to contribute, that deserved the conversation between the physical record and the knowledge tradition that the discovery uniquely makes possible. What would that conversation produce? The combination of genomic analysis and morphological analysis and dating evidence and textile analysis and rock art analysis and the testimony of a knowledge tradition that has been maintaining its record of this country's deep past for 65,000 years? What would that combination, brought to bear on the dome chamber discovery in the spirit of genuine, reciprocal, respectful inquiry, produce? The answer is something we cannot fully predict, which is exactly why it needs to happen. Science does not know in advance what the genuine engagement with evidence will reveal. That is the point of the engagement. That is why it is science rather than simply the confirmation of what is already believed. The body in the cave was placed with care. The hands that placed it knew it, mourned it perhaps, in whatever form mourning takes in a mind built differently from ours, with a larger brain behind a smaller face and a genome that diverged from ours at a depth that humbles the imagination. They mourned it, and they drew it on the wall. And they left, through the narrow passages, back through the slot in the limestone, back to whatever life they returned to, and the cave received the body into its keeping and has held it, without complaint, ever since. Number 15. The open question, and why the fact that it is still open, is itself the answer. There is no conclusion stamped at the bottom of a report that everyone can read. There is no press release from any institution, no species name added to the taxonomic literature, no museum exhibition dedicated to the specimen from the dome chamber, no curriculum update, no textbook revision, no public acknowledgement in any form from any official scientific body of what was found in the lower cave system in South Australia. The question is open. The body is wherever it is, in its controlled conditions, in its new dark, waiting in the different way of things that have been removed from the place where they were placed. The answer that the discovery demands has not been given. Open questions are not failures. This needs to be said clearly because the narrative of withheld discovery can too easily slide into a narrative of failure and betrayal. And while there are things to be critical of in how this case has been handled, the open question itself is not among them. Open questions are the state in which science does its best work. Every closed question was open once, and the period of its openness is the period in which the most productive uncertainty drives the inquiry forward, in which the most careful thinking happens, in which the most important work is done. The open question of the dome chamber specimen is not a failure of science. It is a task that remains. What makes this particular open question more urgent than most is the combination of factors that define it. The physical evidence is not ambiguous. The morphological record is specific and detailed. The genomic data is real and has been produced by multiple independent analyses. The textile analysis is unambiguous about the nature of the material found with the body. The dating evidence is consistent across multiple independent methods. The rock art in the adjacent chamber is photographed and measured. And the knowledge tradition of the people who have been custodians of this country for 65,000 years is available in the forms those custodians choose to make it available for engagement. None of these lines of evidence is sufficient on its own. All of them together constitute something that science is equipped to address, if the institutions involved are willing to address it. The question of whether they are willing, of whether the combination of institutional inertia and the genuine difficulty of the discovery's implications can be overcome, is the question that sits behind the open scientific question. And that question is not a scientific one. It is a human one. It is answered by choices. The choice to publish, the choice to engage, the choice to enter into the kind of genuine, reciprocal conversation with the Adnyamathanha knowledge tradition and with other relevant Indigenous knowledge systems that the discovery demands and that the legal and ethical obligations of research conducted in Indigenous country require. The choice to trust the evidence rather than to wait for a framework that is comfortable enough with the evidence to allow the next step. The choice to be honest in the public forum where science is supposed to be honest about what was found in the dome chamber and what all of the analysis of it produced. These are the choices that remain. They are not easy choices. They are not choices that any individual researcher or any single institution can make alone, because the case has distributed itself across multiple institutional spaces and across the knowledge tradition of a community that has its own interests and its own protocols and its own determination about what is shared and when and how. The choices require coordination and respect and the kind of sustained, genuine engagement that institutional inertia works against. But the physical evidence in the dome chamber was placed there by hands that knew what they were doing, by a tradition that understood what death required and provided for it with skill and care, by beings that were intelligent, that made things, that kept their dead with the specific intentional care that we recognize in ourselves, and that we have not previously recognized in anything else in this country or on this continent or in the evolutionary record of this planet. They were here. They had their own long history. They were part of this country's story in a way that the country's oldest knowledge tradition has been maintaining across all the years that Western science was not paying attention. The cave kept the record. The knowledge tradition kept the account. The physical evidence is real and is accessible to the scientific tools that exist. The question is open, the question is waiting. And somewhere in the dark of a controlled storage environment, or perhaps still in the dome chamber where the lights of the survey team found it, or perhaps in a place that no one who is currently speaking will say clearly, the body remains, as it has always remained, in the specific, patient, unhurried way of things that have been placed in keeper places by hands that understood what keeping means. We know it is there. The evidence says so. The knowledge tradition says so. The photographs and the reports and the samples and the analyses and the accounts of the researchers who were present say so. What we do not know is what we are going to do about it. That is the open question, and the answer to it is ours to give. Number 16, the specific geological conditions that made preservation possible and what they suggest about how long this body was meant to last. When scientists data discovery, they are answering one question: how old is it? But there is a second question that the dome chamber discovery raises that is equally important and less frequently asked. How was it preserved? What combination of conditions allowed organic material to survive in a limestone cave in inland South Australia for 20,000 years or 30,000 or more? Because preservation of that quality across that span of time does not happen by accident. It happens when conditions are favorable. And in this case, the conditions were not merely favorable, they were extraordinarily favorable. Remarkably, specifically, almost unnervingly favorable. The kind of favorable that raises the possibility that the preservation was not entirely accidental, that the location was chosen not merely for its concealment, but for its particular physical properties. The dome chamber is deep. This is the first relevant condition. It sits below the surface by a distance and behind a series of passages that insulate it from the temperature fluctuations of the surface world. The temperature at the surface in this region varies dramatically between seasons and between day and night. The temperature in the dome chamber does not vary. It is constant within a degree, year-round, in perpetuity. The limestone is a thermal buffer. It absorbs and releases heat so slowly that seasonal fluctuations at the surface do not penetrate to the depth at which the dome chamber sits. The constant temperature is the most important single factor in the preservation of organic material, including DNA, over long periods. Variation is what destroys. Constancy is what preserves. The humidity in the dome chamber is regulated by the underground water system. The stream that runs through the lowest level of the cave system maintains the relative humidity in the connected chambers, at a level that is high but not saturating. Not the dripping, constantly wet conditions that promote biological decay, not the dry conditions that desiccate and crack organic material, but the stable middle range that is most conducive to the kind of long, slow, gradual preservation that archaeological and paleontological material requires. This is not unusual in well-developed cave systems, but it is a specific condition, and it was present in this cave. The dome chamber is, as its name describes, a dome. The ceiling curves upward and away from the floor in a shape that sheds water drops from the ceiling to the walls rather than dropping them directly down onto the floor. This is significant because direct drip from cave ceilings is one of the primary agents of physical disturbance in cave deposits, and in chambers where the ceiling is a dome rather than a flat surface. The floor at the center of the chamber tends to be drier than the floor near the walls. The center of the dome chamber, where the body was placed, was the driest part of a cave system that was already in the most favorable range of humidity for preservation. The orientation of the body in the chamber, on its back, centered in the dome, with the textile wrapping concentrated around the lower portion, also served the preservation. The back of the skull was up. The face, such as it was turned toward the wall. The arrangement minimized the exposed surface area of the most delicate features. This could be coincidence, the result of a burial convention that served symbolic purposes and happened also to serve preservational ones. Or it could reflect a knowledge of what this chamber did to bodies placed in it, accumulated over generations of experience with this particular location, this particular set of conditions, this particular keeper place. The people who placed this body knew this cave. They knew it well enough to have a name for it in their tradition, a name that the knowledge system of the Adnyamathanha people has maintained across all the generations since the placement. They knew it as a keeper place. They may have known it as a keeper place because they had observed what it kept, because they had used it before for this purpose, and watched what the cave did with what was placed in it, and had understood, in the accumulated, tested, empirically derived way of a knowledge tradition that has been testing things for 65,000 years. That this particular cave kept things, that the conditions inside it were favorable for the long preservation of what mattered, that the place they chose for this body would hold it. If this is true, and the evidence of the preservation itself is consistent with a deliberate choice of location based on observed properties, then the placement of this body in the dome chamber was not simply a burial, it was an archival act, a decision to place this body in a location specifically suited to preserving it, a location chosen for its keeping properties by a tradition that understood keeping. Someone placed a record in the dark, intending it to last, and it lasted. Number 17, the broader Australian context and the other things that do not quite fit. The dome chamber discovery did not happen in a vacuum. Australia has, for as long as Western science has been conducting research in and on it, been producing findings that do not quite fit the models available to explain them. This is not unique to Australia. Genuinely novel discoveries happen in every part of the world, and the history of science is in large part the history of the frameworks available for understanding those discoveries being expanded, revised, and occasionally overturned by the specific, stubborn reality of what the world actually contains. But Australia has produced a particular density of findings that sit at the edges of established models, that require more from those models than the models were initially designed to provide. And the dome chamber discovery is the most dramatic of these, but is not, in that broader context, entirely alone. The Mungo remains are the most widely known of these. Found at Lake Mungo in the semi-arid interior of New South Wales, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago at the conservative estimate, they represent some of the earliest anatomically modern human remains found anywhere in the world. The discovery pushed the established timeline of modern human presence in Australia back significantly and generated questions about the population history of early Australia that have not been fully resolved. The most discussed of these is the genetic data from the Mungo remains, which generated results that were, when first published, difficult to reconcile with the established model of human migration out of Africa and into Australia. The discussion of those results has been extensive and is ongoing. Less widely known are the cow swamp remains, a population of individuals from a site in northern Victoria dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, whose cranial morphology is, by some measures, more archaic than would be expected for modern humans of that period. The brow ridges are pronounced. The skulls are long and low rather than high and rounded. The bones are robustly built. There have been various explanations offered for the morphological pattern visible in the cow swamp population, ranging from artificial cranial deformation to population genetic isolation to the persistence of archaic traits in a geographically isolated group, and the discussion has continued without reaching a consensus that fully satisfies the available evidence. And there are, in the unpublished record of Australian fieldwork, other findings that have not made it to the literature in ways that allow full discussion. Researchers who have spent careers in Australian cave and rock shelter archaeology speak, in the informal conversations that happen at the edges of conferences, and in the correspondence between colleagues who trust one another about finds that were unusual, about material that was logged and photographed, and then followed an unusual path through the reporting process, about results from dating or analysis that were surprising in ways that made the reporting complicated. This is not unique to Australia. It is a feature of any active research landscape, but the dome chamber discovery sits within a context in which the unusual is not entirely unprecedented, in which the questions it raises are not the first questions of this kind that the Australian archaeological and paleontological record has produced. What is unprecedented in the dome chamber case is the combination, the degree of preservation, the completeness of the specimen, the quality of the associated organic material, the clarity of the genetic signal, even if what that signal says defies current frameworks. The drawings in the adjacent chamber, the concordance with the knowledge tradition of the custodians of that country, the specific multiple independent lines of evidence that all point in the same direction toward the same conclusion, the conclusion that something was in this cave that current science does not have a framework for and current institutions do not know how to publicly acknowledge. That is what makes this discovery different. Not that the evidence exists, but that so much of it exists, and that it is so consistent. Number 18. The quality of the silence in the cave and what silence of that quality means. This is not a scientific point. But not all important points are scientific points, and the experience of the people who have been in the dome chamber is part of the record of this discovery in a way that deserves to be acknowledged, even in a format that tries to be careful and factual and grounded in the physical evidence. The dome chamber is quiet. This is not remarkable for a cave. All caves are quiet, in the sense of being acoustically insulated from the surface world, from traffic and weather, and the continuous low-level noise of human activity that the surface world generates. The stone is a physical barrier to sound as well as to light. The deeper into a cave system you go, the quieter it becomes, until the silence of the deepest chambers is a positive thing, a presence, something you can feel rather than merely the absence of sound. The dome chamber is quiet in that way, but it is also quiet in another way. The examination team members who have spoken about their experience in the chamber describe its silence as having a particular quality that they do not have scientific language for. Not frightening, not oppressive, not the silence of a space that has never held anything. The silence of a space that has held something for a very long time and has learned, in the way that kept spaces learn, how to hold it. This is not a scientific description. The scientists who use these words know it is not a scientific description. They use it anyway, because it is the most accurate description available, and because they are honest people who would rather use imprecise language accurately than precise language inaccurately. The cave kept something. It kept it well. And the quality of that keeping, the specific, stable, constant, preservational quality of the dome chamber, produced the conditions that allowed a body placed there 20 or 30 or more thousands of years ago to survive in a state that allowed, in the era of this survey team, its discovery and its documentation, and the beginning of the question that it is placed before us. The silence of the dome chamber is the silence of a very long keeping coming to an end, of something that was placed in the dark to wait, waiting for the particular moment when the lights came around the corner of the lower passage, and found it, and the waiting ended, and the question began. We are in the question now. The silence is broken. The keeping's over, and what happens next is ours to determine. Number 19. What the discovery demands of us, and why the demand is worth meeting. There is a temptation, when confronted with a discovery of this kind, to respond in one of two inadequate ways. The first is dismissal, to find the uncertainties in the evidence, to emphasize the gaps in the record, to characterize the anomalies as explainable by existing frameworks if those frameworks are applied with sufficient creativity, and to conclude that there is nothing here that requires the existing picture of the world to change. This response is always available. It is rarely correct when applied to genuine anomalies, and its application to the dome chamber evidence requires more creative flexibility in the frameworks than the frameworks themselves can comfortably sustain. The second inadequate response is overclaiming, to treat the discovery as the definitive confirmation of every alternative history of this continent, to attach to it implications that the evidence does not specifically support, to turn a specific and carefully documented anomaly into a general vindication of positions that the evidence does not, in fact, vindicate. This response is also always available, and it is equally problematic because it transforms a scientific question into an ideological one and makes the genuine engagement with the evidence harder rather than easier. What the discovery demands is something different from both of these. It demands the specific response that genuine scientific anomalies have always demanded, which is engagement. Careful, sustained, methodical engagement with the evidence on its own terms. The willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. The willingness to work in collaboration with knowledge traditions that have been maintaining their own evidence of this country's past for 65,000 years, and to treat that collaboration as genuine inquiry rather than as a procedural requirement to be satisfied on the way to a conclusion already reached. It demands the publication of the formal reports. It demands the sharing of the genomic data in a form accessible to the scientific community for review and replication. It demands the full documentation of the rock art in the adjacent chamber in collaboration with the relevant knowledge custodians. It demands the dating of every available datable element from the excavation, with full reporting of the results regardless of whether those results are comfortable. It demands the conversation that the discovery has been waiting for between the physical evidence and the knowledge tradition that has been carrying the account of what that physical evidence represents for longer than the institutions that currently hold it have existed. These are not impossible demands. They are the demands that the scientific process makes of every anomalous discovery. The difficulty in meeting them in this case is not the demands themselves, but the combination of institutional inertia, framework inadequacy, and the particular sensitivity of a discovery that, if the evidence holds, requires the revision of something fundamental about the understood history of this continent and of the beings who have shared it. That revision is not a catastrophe, it is science. It is what happens when the record of the world is more complete and more complex than the models available to describe it. It is what has always happened across the history of scientific inquiry when the world insisted on being more interesting than the current understanding allowed for. The dome chamber discovery insists on being more interesting. The evidence says so. The knowledge tradition says so. The body in the dark says so, in the particular way of bodies that have been placed in keeper places by hands that understood what they were doing and that trusted the keeping to endure. The keeping has endured, the discovery has been made. The question is in the world now, and it is waiting for the answer that only genuine, sustained, honest engagement can provide. We are the engagement. The question is ours. Number 20, the dark and everything that the dark holds. There is one final thing to say, and it is not a scientific point either. It is a point about the dark. The dome chamber is dark. It is completely, absolutely, perfectly dark. The way that deep cave chambers are dark, the way that no surface environment on this planet is dark. Not even on the most overcast night in the most light-polluted city. Not even in the deepest interior of the most lightless room. The dome chamber is dark in the way that means no photon has passed through it. No light of any wavelength has reached its floor or its walls or its dome ceiling, without the specific intervention of a human being carrying a light source into it. It has been dark like that for as long as it has been a chamber, which is longer than the body has been in it, longer than any human tradition has been old enough to remember, longer than any language has had words for what this kind of darkness is. In that darkness, the body was placed. In that darkness, it lay for 20,000 years, or 30,000 or more. In that darkness, the textile around it compacted and darkened and became part of the floor. In that darkness, the flowstone grew over the lowest layers of the organic material at the rate that flowstone grows, which is very slowly, in the accumulation of mineral-rich water deposit by deposit across geological time. In that darkness, the DNA in the bone degraded at the rate that DNA degrades in stable conditions, which is slowly but irreversibly, leaving behind the fragmented record that the laboratories recovered and sequenced and found in the dark of their own analysis, to be something they had no word for. In the adjacent chamber, in that same darkness, the ochre figures on the wall remained as they were placed, unchanged in the dark, as things are unchanged in the dark, waiting for the light that would make them visible again, waiting for the eyes that would find them. In the darkness of the tradition of the Adnyamathanha people, the knowledge of the keeper place was carried forward, generation to generation, in language and in ceremony and in the specific, careful, living transmission of a tradition that knows what it carries and takes seriously the responsibility of carrying it. The darkness of the tradition is a different darkness from the darkness of the cave. It is the darkness of knowledge that is held, kept, tended in the interior of a living culture. Not hidden, but held in the particular way of knowledge that is not for everyone, and not for every moment, but that is there, present, maintained, for the moment when it is needed. The lights came through the slot in the limestone and fell on the dome chamber floor, and found the body, and the long dark of both kinds ended. We are in the light now. The question is visible. The evidence is present. The knowledge tradition is willing to engage on its own terms and in its own time, with the conversation that the discovery has made necessary. What we do with the light is our choice. What we do with the question is our responsibility. What we do with the discovery that a body was pulled from an Australian cave that science still cannot identify is, in the end, a measure of what we are willing to know about the world we share, and about the long, complex, populated history of the continent that holds this cave in its limestone and this body in its keeping dark. The body is there. The evidence is there. The knowledge tradition is there. The question is waiting. Sleep well, and think about it when the dark is quiet and the mind is soft and the distance between now and 20,000 years ago seems in the particular way of the hours before sleep, not quite so far as it does in the full noise of the day. The cave is there, the body is there, the question is real, and somewhere in the dark, the keeping continues. There is a particular quality to the way old limestone holds cold. It is not the cold of the outside air in winter, which is dynamic and carries moisture and changes with the cloud cover and the position of the sun. It is a constant cold, a thermal equilibrium established over geological time, a temperature that reflects the average of the air above across hundreds or thousands of years, filtered down through the porous rock into the chambers below. It is the cold of the long average, the cold of everything smoothed out, everything reduced to the persistent mean of all the seasons that have moved through the landscape above since the cave took its present form. The team that documented the body in the dome chamber described the cold as one of the consistent features of the environment. Not threatening cold, not the kind of cold that makes hands fail or cognition slow, but the kind of cold that makes the body aware of time, of the fact that it is inside something ancient, of the fact that the temperature around it is a record of accumulated time in the same way that a sediment layer or a flowstone or a carbon date is a record of accumulated time. The body lay in that cold for the entirety of its long custody. The cold preserved it. The cold worked against the biochemical processes of decomposition in the same way the stable humidity worked against the desiccation that would have reduced the organic material faster. The cold was part of the reason the hands were intact. Part of the reason the textile retained its structure. Part of the reason the DNA in the bone, fragmented as it was recoverable at all. Cold as archive. Cold as the mechanism of memory in stone. This is not metaphor. This is material chemistry, thermal dynamics, the concrete physics of how organic matter slows its dissolution in stable low temperatures. The cave is cold, the body is preserved, the connection is direct and explicable and requires no mysticism, only an appreciation for how the physical world operates when the conditions for a particular kind of preservation are met and maintained over a very long time. But the cold also carries a quality that is harder to account for in purely physical terms, not supernatural, not outside the ordinary operations of the world, but present in a way that the documentation records as noteworthy, which is the word a scientific report uses when it means something mattered to the people in the room, and they did not want to omit it entirely, but also did not want to overclaim it. The people in the room felt the cold as significant, as different from incidental, as a feature of the place that was doing something beyond merely being cold. Whether that quality belongs to the place or to the people who encountered the place is a question that can be debated without resolution. What is not in question is that the quality was recorded, and that the recording of it says something about the encounter between the team in the dome chamber and the body that careful, measured documentation was adequate to convey. 21 numbered items on the list, if you have been counting, and the cold is one of them, not the coldest item, not the strangest, but one of the ones that stays. There is a concept in the oral traditions associated with the deeper layers of the Adnyamathanha knowledge about this country that translates loosely as the conversation that the country is having with itself, not the country as metaphor for the land in the political sense. The country in the older sense, the specific country, this limestone, this aquifer system, these particular ridge formations, and the way the light sits on them in the late afternoon. The country is a coherent entity with its own processes of exchange, its own logic of what belongs where and what the relationships between things are and how those relationships are maintained across time. The cave is part of that conversation. The body is part of it. The textile and the ochre figures and the morphology and the DNA and the knowledge tradition that maintain the name for the place across thousands of years are all part of the same conversation that the country has been having with itself about what this place is and what it holds and what that means for the living and the dead and the relationship between them. This framing is not comfortable for all researchers. It is not comfortable because it assigns intentionality and relational logic to what Western scientific frameworks understand as passive physical systems. The rock does not intend, the sediment does not mean, the cave does not converse. In the frame of the physical sciences as they are conventionally practiced, these statements are true. But the Adnyamathanha knowledge tradition is not practicing the physical sciences as they are conventionally practiced. It is doing something else, something that has maintained accurate, complex, generationally transmitted knowledge about this specific landscape for a period of time that the physical sciences are only beginning to appreciate. The conversation with itself framing is not a claim about the physics of rock. It is a claim about a way of engaging with country that produces knowledge, that has produced knowledge across a span of time that no other knowledge system in this landscape can match. To dismiss it is to dismiss the record. And the record in this case is the only record that says where the cave is and what it has always been called and what the obligation of the living is toward what it holds. Somewhere in the controlled storage facility where the body now lies, in the stable temperature and stable humidity that the storage protocols require. The cold continues. A different cold from the cave cold, a managed cold, a cold produced by technology rather than by limestone and aquifer and geological time, but a cold that serves the same function, the same slowing, the same maintenance of what exists against the processes that would dissolve it. The body is in the cold, the textile is in the cold. The casts of the hands and the skull and the full skeleton are in cabinets in the facility. The DNA sequences are in a database in a building somewhere with servers and climate control and security protocols. The ochre figures are still on the walls of the adjacent chamber in the cave, which is still sealed, which is still in the limestone, which is still cold. The knowledge tradition is not in cold storage. The knowledge tradition is alive. It is being carried forward right now, in language and ceremony and the specific, careful, interior transmission of knowledge that is not written, but that is not therefore less durable or less precise. It has been alive for the entire period that the body lay in the cave. It will continue to be alive regardless of what the institutions decide to do with the physical evidence. This asymmetry matters. The institutions that hold the physical evidence are uncertain how to proceed. They are uncertain what category the evidence belongs to, uncertain what the publication of the genomic data would mean for existing models, uncertain what the legal and ethical frameworks are for consulting with the knowledge custodians on questions about the disposition of remains that do not fit neatly into the categories those frameworks were designed for. The knowledge tradition is not uncertain. It knows what the cave is. It knows what was in it. It knows what the obligation of the living is toward the dead. It has always known. The uncertainty is not distributed evenly across the parties involved in this discovery, and the distribution of uncertainty is a data point about which knowledge system is operating with more clarity in relation to this particular situation. Sleep is a kind of cave, not metaphor, not quite. The way the body goes into sleep is the way the body goes into an environment that is not the waking environment, that operates by different rules, that produces different outputs, that holds the self in a particular kind of keeping that the waking state cannot replicate. The restoration that sleep provides is real. The consolidation of memory that sleep performs is documented and measurable. The particular quality of the hours just before full sleep, when the mind is soft and the boundaries of the day are dissolving, and the ordinary hierarchies of waking attention have relaxed their grip, that quality is real and produces real effects on the brain and the body. In that pre-sleep state, the mind reaches differently. Associations form between things that waking logic would keep separate. The distance between a cave in the limestone country of South Australia and the room where you are lying now does not feel like the distance it would feel in full daylight. The distance between 20,000 years ago and this moment does not feel like 20,000 years. The question of what the body in the dome chamber means for the story we tell about who has lived on this earth, and for how long and in what variety, feels less like an abstract academic problem, and more like a personal question, the kind that arrives in the soft hours before sleep and sits with you. This is the value of the ASMR format for this material. Not because the material needs to be softened or made more palatable. The material does not need to be softened. It is what it is, an unresolved discovery of significant scientific and cultural weight. But the soft hours before sleep are the hours when the mind is most capable of sitting with uncertainty without resolving it, of holding a question open without needing to close it, of letting the weight of something real settle into the body without the defensive reflexes of the waking day. The body in the cave held its question in the cold and the dark for 20,000 years or more. You can hold it for the duration of the hours between now and morning. It will still be there. The question will still be real. The cave will still be sealed. The body will still be in controlled storage. The knowledge tradition will still be alive and continuing. Nothing is lost by sleeping with the question open. Something might be gained. The wind in the limestone country at night moves through the grass in a particular way. If you have been in that country, you know the sound, the dry grass moving, the air carrying the cold of the open sky, and the faint mineral undertone that country air carries when it has moved across limestone for a long distance. The caves breathe with the wind. The pressure changes above cause small movements in the air columns below, tiny inhalations and exhalations through the fissures in the slots and the dark mouths in the rock. The dome chamber breathes. It breathed when the body was placed in it. It breathed through the 1,000 years before the cavers found the slot entrance in the 1980s and made their note about the inhabited quality of the air moving out of it. It breathed through the days of documentation and the debates of the institutional review and the careful transport of the body to controlled storage. It breathes now. The cave does not know that we have questions. The cave does not know that we are uncertain. The cave is breathing because the wind is moving above it and the physics of pressure and column air are operating as they have always operated. But the breathing is real and it is happening now, and it is continuous with the breathing that happened when the body was in the chamber and before the body was in the chamber, and long before the species that placed the body there had arrived in this part of the continent, however they arrived and from wherever they came. The long continuity of the physical world is sometimes a comfort. The cave was there before any of this happened and will be there after. The limestone is old in a way that makes all of this seem brief. The aquifer below it is older still. The pressures that folded and cracked the rock into the formation that created the dome chamber acted across a span of time that makes the 20,000 years of the body's custody seem recent. In that long continuity, the question of the body is a small question, significant for what it means about the history of the species and the continent and the knowledge traditions that have carried forward across the long human past, but small in the scale of the rock, small in the scale of the time that made the rock. The limestone does not mind the question. The limestone has time. And so do you in the soft hours before sleep, when the question can sit with you gently and the breathing of the cave in the wind. Moved darkness of the South Australian limestone country is, if you are quiet enough and still enough and close enough to sleep, not entirely outside the range of what can be imagined. The cave is there. The body is there. The question is real. The knowledge tradition is alive and continuing. And the dark is the same dark it has always been. Sleep well. There are researchers who have spent years thinking about the implications of this discovery without being able to write about it formally, not because they are forbidden to write, but because the categories are not available. The journals that would publish work of this kind require that the work fit within established taxonomic frameworks. A finding that sits outside all established taxonomic frameworks is not a finding the journal is structured to receive. The peer review process, which is designed to evaluate the quality of reasoning and evidence within existing frameworks, is not designed to evaluate a finding that calls the frameworks themselves into question. This is not a failure of the researchers. It is a structural feature of how knowledge is organized and validated in the institution of science. The institution is very good at advancing knowledge within established frameworks. It is less good at handling findings that require the frameworks to be revised before the finding can be assessed. The history of science contains examples of exactly this kind of structural delay, of findings that preceded the conceptual infrastructure required to receive them, of evidence that waited in drawers and archives for the framework to catch up. The body in the dome chamber may be one of those findings. The evidence exists. The documentation is meticulous. The DNA sequences are in the database. The casts of the bones are in the cabinets. The textile fibers are in the sample archive. Everything needed to make the case is present and preserved and waiting. The framework is the problem. The framework that would allow the case to be made in the terms the institution requires is the framework that the case itself is calling into question. This is the loop. This is the reason the silence has lasted as long as it has. Not suppression, not conspiracy, not deliberate concealment. A structural impossibility that no individual researcher can resolve by working harder or writing more clearly. Because the problem is not in the individual researcher or the quality of the writing. The problem is in the shape of the container. The container needs to change. The change will come because the evidence will eventually exceed the capacity of the existing container to hold it, or because a researcher in a position to propose a new framework will do so in a venue where the proposal can be received, or because the knowledge custodians will decide that the time for a different kind of engagement has arrived and will initiate the conversation that changes what is available to be known. The change will come because it always does. The framework always eventually gives way to the evidence that does not fit it. This is how science advances, slowly, unevenly, with resistance and delay, and the accumulated weight of what cannot be held back indefinitely. The question is not whether the change will come. The question is how long it takes, and what is lost in the interval, and what could be gained by moving toward it with more intention and less resistance than the institution typically manages. This is the work that remains, not the dramatic work of revelation, not the satisfying arc of a mystery conclusively solved. The slower work of framework revision, of consultation and collaboration across the distance between institutional science and living knowledge tradition, of deciding what kind of knowledge system we want to have in relation to discoveries that exceed what we currently know how to receive. The body in the dome chamber waited 20,000 years. It is patient evidence. It will wait as long as it takes for the framework to arrive that allows it to be properly heard. The question is whether we will be equally patient with ourselves, or whether we will choose to move with more intention toward the conversation the evidence is waiting for. The dark outside is the dark it has always been. The stars above the limestone country are the stars they have always been. The cold in the cave is the cold it has always been. The body is in storage, in the cold, in the dark of the facility. The knowledge tradition is alive in the night, carried in the interior of the people who carry it. Everything's in place, everything's present. The meeting that is needed has not yet fully happened. But it is closer than it was, and the night is long enough, and the dark is quiet enough, and the distance between now and the moment when the meeting happens is not so great that it cannot be crossed. Sleep. Let the question be with you. Let the cave be cold in the back of the mind. Let the body be there, patient in the dark. In the morning, there will be other things. The day will have its own demands and its own noise and its own immediate business. But in the quiet before sleep, the cave is there. The body is there. The question is real and it is yours, as it is anyone's who has followed this far into the dark. The limestone country is vast and old and patient. The question is held in it like the cold is held in it, steadily, without urgency, in the long time of the rock. Good night. The keeping continues. There is a particular quality to the last thought before sleep takes hold. It is not fully formed. It does not resolve into a conclusion. It sits at the edge of language, and then falls past the edge into something that is not language anymore, but that is not nothing either. The research team that documented the dome chamber used the word noteworthy for what could not be made to fit the categories available. The mind before sleep does something similar with what cannot be resolved before morning. It holds it at the edge and then lets it fall into the dark that is not empty but only unlit. The cave is there, the body is in the cold, the knowledge is alive in the night. The question is real and waiting and patient as limestone. Fall into the dark now. The keeping continues without you while you rest. There is a word in geology for the process by which a cave system reveals itself incrementally to the people who are mapping it. Speleologists call it pushing, which means moving into the parts of the cave that have not been entered before, the parts where the passage narrows, or the ceiling drops, or the floor becomes uncertain, and the person with the light has to make a decision about whether to continue or to stop. Pushing is not reckless. It is careful and methodical and conducted with the correct equipment and the correct protocols for safety. But it involves a moment, repeated, of choosing to go further into the unknown passage rather than stopping at the edge of what is already known. The team that entered the dome chamber did not call what they were doing pushing. They were not mapping. They were documenting something that had already been found. But the quality of the decision making inside the dome chamber had something in common with what speleologists mean when they use that word. Each stage of the documentation involved a choice to go further into what the evidence was showing, rather than stopping at the edge of what existing frameworks could comfortably receive. The choice to continue extraction when the initial morphological findings were already unusual. The choice to sequence the DNA when the morphology alone was already without precedent. The choice to date the textile when the body was already generating more questions than the team had frameworks to answer. Each of those choices was a kind of pushing. Each one produced a further chamber of evidence that was stranger than the one before. Each one made the eventual silence more complete, because the more complete the documentation became, the less possible it was to dismiss any single element of it as anomalous. The anomaly became total. The finding became the kind of finding that has no place to go within the existing structure of the discipline. This is not comfortable knowledge for the researchers involved. To push into a cave and find a chamber that cannot be mapped within any existing survey is to have done your job correctly and still be unable to complete it. The cave is real, the chamber is real, the instruments are functioning, but the maps do not have a category for what the instruments are showing. You write it down. You document it as carefully as you can. You use the word noteworthy for what you cannot otherwise categorize, and then you wait for the cartography to catch up. The cartography of human origins is very good at what it does within the territory it has already surveyed. The fossil record of the known hominins is detailed enough that a new finding that fits within the existing taxonomy can be placed within it with reasonable confidence. The genomic databases are comprehensive enough that a new sequence that matches a known lineage can be identified rapidly. The archaeological record of the known occupations of the Australian continent is extensive enough that a new site that fits within the known sequence of habitation can be contextualized without undue difficulty. But a finding that does not fit the known taxonomy, that does not match any lineage in the database, that does not correspond to any known occupation sequence, cannot be placed. It can only be documented, and then the documentation can only wait for the taxonomy, the database, the sequence to be revised in ways that make room for what has been found. The revision is coming. The rate at which genomic analysis is expanding the known diversity of ancient hominin populations, finding ghost lineages in the genomes of living people in ancient samples, identifying introgression events that were not previously suspected, the rate of that expansion means that the conceptual space available for anomalous findings is larger now than it was 10 years ago, and will be larger still in another 10. The Denisovans were ghost lineage findings that became recognized taxa. The mystery hominin introgression in the genomes of some Melanesian populations is still not fully resolved. The deep diversity of the human story on this planet is still being discovered. The body in the dome chamber will eventually have a place in that story. The question of when is a question about institutional capacity and political will, and the specific slow, difficult work of framework revision. It is not a question about the evidence. The evidence is present and complete and waiting. In the meantime, the cave breathes, the cold holds, the knowledge tradition continues. The question remains open, patient, real. The darkness outside the window where you're lying is the same darkness that is above the limestone country right now. The same sky, differently positioned, differently marked by the stars as they appear from where you are. But the same dark beyond the stars, the same depth of space that the light of those stars has crossed to reach the atmosphere of this planet. The same old universe that holds the Australian limestone, and the room where you are, and the cave with its body, and the facility where the body is stored now. All of it equally small in the scale of what the dark beyond the stars contains. This is not meant to diminish the question. The question is human-sized and matters at the human scale. But there is something in the pre-sleep mind that finds a particular quality of rest in the awareness of scale, in the understanding that the universe that contains this question is so much larger than the question that the question's unresolved state is not a catastrophe. It is a temporary condition. It is the normal state of a question that is real and important and has not yet found its answer. The stars are there. The cave is there. The body is there. The question is real. The dark is the dark it has always been. Deep, patient, indifferent to urgency. Available in equal measure to everything that exists within it. Let it hold you now. The cave is there. The body is there. The question is real. Sleep well.